My son called to tell me I wasn't welcome at his father-in-law's 4th of July party. 3 weeks later, his voice was shaking on the phone. Dad, why is your name on every news channel in the state? I'm Walter, 68 years old, and I've spent the last decade letting my family believe I was exactly what they thought I was. A tired old man with nothing left to offer anyone. The call came in at 4:15 on a Wednesday afternoon. I remember because I was out on the back porch resetting the mousetrap under the bird feeder, and I had to wipe the grease off my hands before I could get my phone out of my pocket. It was my son, Bradley. Bradley almost never called unless he needed something, and even then he usually let his wife do the asking. So when I saw his name light up the screen, I felt that old familiar tightening in my chest, half hope and half dread. I said hello. He didn't return the greeting. He launched straight into it, the way he always did when he'd rehearse something in the car on the way to work and needed to get it out before his nerve failed him. Dad, we need to talk about the 4th. I told him I was listening. Frank is hosting this year. At the lake house. It's a big deal, Dad. Half his business partners are going to be there. And Sarah and I think, well, we think it's better if you sit this one out. Frank was Sarah's father. Sarah was my son's wife of 4 years. And Frank was a man who had made his fortune flipping distressed properties and who wore his money the way some men wear cologne so that you couldn't be within 10 feet of him without smelling it. I'd met him exactly 3 times. Each time he'd shaken my hand a half second too long and asked me what I did for a living in a tone that already assumed the answer would disappoint him. I asked Bradley why, keeping my voice flat and even. I wasn't going to hand him the satisfaction of hearing me wounded. He sighed, the kind of sigh that tells you the other person has already decided you're being unreasonable just by asking. It's not personal, Dad. Frank's trying to close a deal with some investors that weekend, and he wants everything to look a certain way. You know how you get around new people. A little quiet, a little awkward. It's an important weekend for us. For my career, Frank's talking about bringing me into the firm. I understood him perfectly. I was a variable he couldn't control, a loose thread on an otherwise expensive suit. To Bradley and Sarah, I was a retired shop teacher living alone in a 2-bedroom Rambler with a truck that had 210,000 miles on it, and they had long ago decided that the divorce 15 years back had left me with nothing but a modest pension and a house that needed a new roof. So you're choosing your father-in-law's business deal over your own father? I said. I wanted the words out in the open air where neither of us could pretend I hadn't said them. Don't make this into something it isn't, Bradley snapped. It's one party. We'll do Thanksgiving together. Just the 3 of us, I promise. Frank just needs this weekend to go perfectly. And honestly, Dad, no offense, but you'd stick out. I didn't argue. There's no arguing with a man who's already decided you're an inconvenience. I told him to have a good time, and I hung up the phone before he could hear whatever might have slipped into my voice if I'd stayed on the line a second longer. The porch was quiet after that, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. My own son had just put a price on my presence, and I'd come up short. They thought I had nothing. They thought I was harmless, forgettable, easy to leave off a guest list. They had no idea how wrong they were. I went inside, locked the back door out of habit rather than necessity, and walked down the hall past the room that used to be Bradley's, past the faded rectangle on the wallpaper where a family photo used to hang, and into what I called my workshop. It looked like exactly what a retired shop teacher's workshop should look like: pegboard walls, a table saw gathering dust, a coffee can full of mismatched screws. But behind the false back of the tool cabinet was a door, and behind that door was a room with 3 monitors, a secure server, and a life my family had never once suspected existed. I sat down and woke the screens. Numbers filled them: real-time positions, wire confirmations, a web of holding companies that stretched from a small office in Cincinnati to accounts in 4 different countries. When Diane left me 15 years ago, her lawyers took the house, the good car, and every liquid dollar they could find exactly as I let them. What they never found, because I never told a soul, was the intellectual property. 30 years teaching industrial arts and running a side consultancy in food safety engineering had left me holding 4 patents on contamination detection systems used in cold storage warehousing, the kind of unglamorous, unsexy technology that every major grocery distributor in the country quietly licenses and nobody ever thinks about. I was earning more in a slow month than Frank's entire real estate operation cleared in a good year, and not one person in my family knew it, because I'd wanted Bradley to grow up believing that character mattered more than a bank balance. Clearly, that particular lesson hadn't taken. My eyes drifted to a battered banker's box sitting on the corner of my desk. Frank had dropped it off 2 months earlier, practically thrown it at me on his way out my driveway. Inside were the engineering specs for his newest project, a chain of cold storage distribution warehouses he was building on the outskirts of 3 different cities, warehouses that would eventually store meat, dairy, and produce for half the grocery chains in the region. Figured you could look these over, he'd said, smirking. You used to teach this stuff, right? Tell me if the contractors missed a comma somewhere. Not like you've got much else going on. He thought he was tossing a bone to a pathetic old man. He had no idea who he'd actually handed those blueprints to. I hadn't touched the box in weeks. But tonight, after being told I wasn't fit to attend a backyard barbecue, I pulled it open and spread the pages across my drafting table. I started with the refrigeration schematics and worked outward. Hours passed, my coffee went cold beside me, and then my pencil stopped moving entirely. The temperature monitoring systems specified in the design were the correct, industry-certified sensors, the kind that trigger automatic shutdowns and alerts the moment cold chain integrity is broken. But the procurement manifest, tucked loosely inside the folder like Frank had forgotten it was even there, told a different story. The actual units being installed were a stripped-down, uncertified knockoff being imported through a shell distributor, units that failed to reliably detect temperature breaches above a certain threshold. I ran the numbers twice, then a third time. What Frank was building wasn't just a cost-cutting shortcut. It was a system that would let spoiled meat and contaminated dairy sit in warehouses reading safe on every digital display, while it silently incubated listeria and salmonella, then get shipped out to grocery stores in 4 states, straight onto family dinner tables. He was saving $11 million in procurement costs by installing sensors that couldn't be trusted to catch a single failure, and he was doing it across 3 separate facilities feeding some of the largest supermarket chains in the country. The sting of being uninvited from a barbecue evaporated instantly. This wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. This was foodborne illness on an industrial scale, aimed at families who would never know the difference between a warehouse that failed safely and one engineered to fail silently. I didn't call Bradley to scream at him. I didn't call Frank to demand an explanation. Warning them would only give them time to swap the manifests and bury the evidence. I needed to move with precision, not anger. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in almost 4 years. It belonged to Renata Cole. 20 years earlier, before she became a senior investigator for the FDA's Criminal Enforcement Division, she'd been a 19-year-old kid working a summer internship in my shop class, the only student who ever actually wanted to understand why a machine failed instead of just fixing it and moving on. I'd kept half an eye on her career since. The line picked up on the second ring. "Walter," she said. "It's been a while. What's going on?" "I need you to look at a cold chain monitoring system," I said. And I told her everything: the sensors, the manifest, the 3 warehouses, the math on what happens when contaminated product sits undetected in a supply chain feeding 4 states of grocery stores. There was a long pause on her end. "You have documentation? Physical proof right now in your hands?" "I have the blueprints and the procurement manifest." He handed them to me himself. He thought I was too old and too irrelevant to understand what I was reading. "Do not let those documents leave your sight," she said, her voice suddenly all business. "I'm pulling a team together. This is exactly the kind of case that gets fast-tracked once a magistrate sees the public health exposure." I hung up the phone and sat back in my chair. Somewhere across town, my son and his father-in-law were probably finalizing seating charts for a lake house party I hadn't been invited to. They had no idea the war had already started, and that I was the one who'd started it. I spent the next day tracing the money, the same way I'd once traced load paths through a failing structure back when I still consulted on industrial builds. The shell distributor supplying the counterfeit sensors was called Meridian Cold Systems on paper, a sleek website, a listed address in a business park, nothing that would raise a flag to anyone who didn't know what a real cold storage supplier's footprint actually looks like. Real sensor manufacturers have calibration labs, certification paperwork, factory audits. Meridian had none of it. It was a shell, funneling cheap counterfeit hardware through a single overseas broker and marking it up as certified equipment. I reached out to an old contact who still worked logistics compliance for a major shipping conglomerate, a man I'd done a consulting favor for a decade back. He ran the import codes for me. The answer came back within the hour. The sensors were manufactured in a facility that had been blacklisted twice for falsifying calibration certificates. Frank knew exactly what he was buying. He was pocketing the difference between real certified equipment and cheap counterfeit hardware, laundering it through Meridian, and funneling the profits into a private equity fund that, according to public filings, he'd used to leverage his stake in 3 additional properties, including the lake house where he was throwing his 4th of July party. I forwarded everything to Renata: the shipping logs, the blacklist history, the ownership trail connecting Meridian back to a holding company with Frank's name buried 3 layers deep in the paperwork. It was airtight. But there was one more detail that stopped me cold as I cross-referenced the warehouse floor plans against the sensor placement diagrams. The layout, the specific zonal detection pattern designed to catch temperature drift before it became dangerous. I recognized it immediately because I had designed it. 14 years earlier, I'd published a paper on optimal sensor placement for large-scale cold storage that had quietly become an industry reference. Frank's engineers had lifted my exact zonal methodology, my patented detection logic, and simply swapped out the certified sensors for garbage hardware, assuming my design would somehow compensate for equipment that couldn't do its job. He'd stolen the one thing that might have made his warehouses safe and paired it with the one thing guaranteed to make them lethal. He'd sat across from me at Thanksgiving 2 years running. He'd shaken my hand and called me old-timer with that little smirk of his. And the whole time, without knowing it, he'd been standing on my life's work while trying to bury my son's family in a fraud that could sicken thousands of people. I called Renata back. "There's more," I said. "He's using my patented detection design. I can prove ownership going back 14 years. She exhaled slowly on the other end. "Walter, that changes things. That's not just food safety fraud anymore. That's intellectual property theft layered on top of a public health case. I've got enough right now to get a magistrate's attention even during a holiday week." I didn't sleep much that night. Not out of guilt, out of the particular focused calm of a man watching a plan click into place piece by piece. 2 days before the 4th, my phone buzzed with a text from Bradley. No greeting, just a photograph: the lake house deck, string lights, a long table set with white linen and citronella candles, Frank in a Hawaiian shirt holding up 2 thick steaks toward the camera like trophies. The caption read, "Wish you could see this, Dad. Frank's smoking a whole beef tenderloin for tomorrow. Sarah's dad really knows how to do it right. Anyway, happy early 4th. He wasn't sharing a nice moment. He was rubbing my face in exactly what I'd been excluded from, making sure I understood precisely how small and outdated I was next to a man who could smoke a beef tenderloin the size of a fire log for 40 guests. 10 years ago, that message would have gutted me. I would have called him back, hurt and defensive, and given him exactly the reaction he was fishing for. Instead, I looked at that photograph with nothing but cold clarity, because Bradley had just handed me something far more valuable than an insult. I zoomed in. Behind Frank, mounted on the exterior wall of the lake house, was a small keypad panel, a security system control unit, its digital display just barely legible in the photo. I enhanced it, sharpened the contrast the same way I used to inspect microfractures in stressed steel samples. I could make out the property's address plate beside the panel, confirming the exact lake house location down to the dock number. In the background of a second photo Bradley sent an hour later, showing Frank's boat pulling up to the private dock. I could read the registration numbers stenciled on the hull. I called Renata immediately. "I've got the exact location," I told her. "Lake house, private dock, and I can confirm the timeline. They're hosting a large gathering there tomorrow evening, food service starting around 6, main course around 8. "That's the kind of confirmation we need for a clean approach," she said. "We don't want agents fumbling around a property looking for the right dock in the dark. This is exactly what we needed." Bradley thought he was mocking me with a photo of a smoking brisket. He'd handed federal investigators the precise coordinates of the crime scene. The 4th of July arrived warm and bright. I spent the morning on my own back porch, coffee in hand, listening to the neighborhood kids setting off firecrackers 2 streets over. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the quiet, focused stillness of a man who has done everything he can and is now simply waiting for gravity to finish its work. Around 7 that evening, my phone rang. It was Bradley, and before I even answered, I already knew what I was about to hear. I picked up. I didn't say hello. I just waited. Chaos poured through the speaker, shouting, the heavy thud of boots on a wooden deck, a woman screaming somewhere in the background, The unmistakable, authoritative bark of federal agents ordering people to get down and keep their hands visible. Dad, Bradley's voice cracked, high and disbelieving. Dad, what is happening? There are agents everywhere. They've got Frank on the ground. They're saying something about food safety fraud. Dad, why is your name on their paperwork? Why is your name on the news right now? I kept my voice level. You're watching the consequences of your father-in-law's decisions, Bradley. No, this has to be a mistake. Tell me you didn't do this. It's not a mistake, I said quietly. Frank installed counterfeit temperature sensors in 3 cold storage warehouses, feeding grocery stores across 4 states. Real ones cost more, so he swapped them for hardware that can't reliably detect a contamination breach, and he pocketed the difference. He also stole a detection system I designed and patented 14 years ago, and used it to make his fraud look legitimate. I found out because he handed me the blueprints himself and told me to check them for typos. The line went quiet except for his ragged breathing and the chaos behind him. I could almost hear the pieces locking into place in his mind, the news anchor's voice rising behind him now, reading my name off the same broadcast that was airing my professional history, my patents, my 30 years of quiet, uncelebrated work that had just been credited, publicly, as the reason a public health catastrophe had been stopped before a single person got sick. You knew this whole time, Bradley whispered. You had all this money, all these patents, and you let us think. I let you think I was exactly what you needed me to be so you could feel superior, I said. That's on both of us. But I didn't destroy your father-in-law's business because I was hurt about a barbecue, Bradley. I did it because he was willing to poison strangers to save $11 million. Please, he said, and his voice had dropped into something smaller, something that sounded almost like the boy I used to teach to ride a bike in the church parking lot. Please, can you call someone? Can you make this go away? Sarah's whole family is going to lose everything. I can't fix this, I told him. And even if I could, I wouldn't. He built his fortune on a foundation he knew could kill people. I'm not going to spend a single dollar protecting that. I heard an agent tell Bradley to step back from the property line. I have to go, I said. Take care of Sarah tonight. This is going to be a hard road for both of you. I hung up and set the phone face down on my desk. The house was silent again, the kind of silence that follows a controlled demolition rather than an explosion deliberate, earned, and clean. 6 weeks later, on a gray Saturday morning, I heard tires crunch too fast into my gravel driveway. I looked out the kitchen window and saw a car I didn't recognize, an older sedan with a dented bumper, and Bradley climbing out of it looking like he hadn't slept properly in a month. He didn't knock. He just stood on my porch steps, hands jammed in his jacket pockets, staring at the welcome mat like it might tell him what to say. I opened the door and waited. Can I come in? He said. Not really a question. I stepped aside and let him in. I made 2 cups of coffee without asking if he wanted one, the way I used to when he was 17, and came home upset about something he didn't want to talk about directly. He sat at my kitchen table, wrapped both hands around the mug like it was the only warm thing left in his life, and told me everything. Frank was facing federal charges that could put him away for over a decade. The 3 warehouses were shut down, the assets frozen pending trial, and it turned out Frank had leveraged nearly everything he owned, including the lake house, including Sarah's own modest inheritance from her grandmother, which he'd quietly folded into his investment fund without her knowledge against the same fraudulent enterprise. Sarah had lost her father's business, her childhood home, and was now working temp reception shifts to help cover rent on the small apartment they downsized into. Bradley had been quietly let go from the job Frank had promised to hand him, because no company wanted its name anywhere near the fallout. I didn't come here to ask you for money, he said, before I could even wonder whether that's what this was. I know you'd say no, and honestly, Dad, I think you'd be right too. I didn't say anything. I let him keep going. I spent years thinking you were just behind, stuck, like you'd given up on ever having more. And I didn't want that for myself, so I chased the opposite of you. I chased Frank because Frank looked like everything you weren't. And it turns out everything he was fake. All of it. The boat, the lake house, the tenderloin on the grill, none of it was real, Dad. It was other people's money and other people's safety, and I was so desperate to be near it that I told my own father he wasn't good enough to sit at the table. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't performing it, and I'd seen enough performed tears in my life to know the difference. I'm not going to hand you a check, I told him gently. Not because I don't love you, Because you need to learn how to build something real with your own hands, the way I did, and I'd be robbing you of that if I bailed you out now. I know, he said. I'm not asking. I wanted to know if I still have a father, because I spent a long time acting like I didn't need one. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. You'll always have a father, I said, but you're going to have to earn your way back to the man you used to look up to before all this. That part's on you. He nodded, wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, and for the first time in years, he looked like my son again instead of a stranger wearing his face. 3 months after that, the story had mostly faded from the news cycle, the way these things do once the arraignments are filed and the cameras find some fresher outrage. But the warehouses stayed shuttered, the counterfeit sensors were pulled from every facility that had installed them, and somewhere out there, families who would never know my name kept buying groceries that hadn't spent 4 days silently spoiling behind a screen that said everything was fine. Bradley started calling me every Sunday just to talk, the way he used to before Sarah's family and their money convinced him a modest father wasn't worth the phone call. He got a job at a hardware store of all places, learning the trade from the ground floor, and told me once, almost laughing, that he finally understood why I used to love teaching kids how machines actually worked instead of just handing them the manual. I still keep my workshop the way it's always looked from the outside: pegboard, sawdust, a coffee can of mismatched screws. I don't need anyone to know what's behind that false panel. I never built that hidden life to be discovered. I built it so that when the moment came, when it actually mattered, I'd have exactly what I needed and no one would ever have seen it coming. Some structures fail because the steel underneath was never strong enough to begin with. Frank's empire was never going to hold. It was only ever a matter of time and pressure. I didn't tear it down out of spite. I just stopped standing in the way of what was always going to happen to a thing built on lies. What would you have done if the people who wrote you off were the ones who came crawling back?